Donald Trump gets his third indictment and everybody sits and waits, I don't know, for the fourth, fifth, sixth indictment that might come down. What does this one mean and what is this one over? Let's talk to our friend Andy McCarthy joins us now, contributing editor at National Review, a Fox News contributor and friend here of the Annie Frey Show. Welcome back to the show, Andy. Good to have you back.
Annie, great to be here.
So I want to give you the opportunity to kind of lay out for us the key points that you want people who are voting Americans, tax-paying Americans, concerned Americans to know about indictment number 3 for Donald Trump.
Well, I think this one is really a political act that's been kind of dressed up as a legal exercise. Essentially, I think that the political process, specifically the impeachment process, which is the way that our Constitution really anticipates that executive misbehavior will be dealt with, that it'll be Congress that checks the president. They failed to hold former President Trump accountable in that process. That hasn't been an acceptable outcome to a lot of people, as we've seen for the last couple of years. And as a result, they have decided to try to go after him in the criminal justice system. And the problem I think they have is not that there isn't a lot of evidence of terrible behavior by the former president. There is. But the problem is that the criminal system is not a good proxy for impeachment. And in order to prosecute Trump criminally, Smith is in the position of having to stretch some penal laws in order to try to make the post-2020 election conduct kind of fit into those statutes. They're made really for impeachment because for impeachment you don't need a criminal offense. And it's enough, like, for example, with respect to the Capitol riot, it would be enough to show that someone was morally and politically responsible for that whole thing having happened. But in the criminal system, you have to show that somebody not only was, morally and politically responsible, but that it's criminally actionable in the sense that you could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he wanted violence to happen and that he did affirmative things to make it happen. And they obviously don't have that kind of evidence. So I think it's a problematic case, especially compared to the Florida case, which I thought was much stronger.
Yeah, you've spoken with us. We're speaking with Andy McCarthy right now. You've spoken with us about different indictments that President Trump has had and how you feel some are much stronger than others. And when you focus in on the indictment number 3 that has a lot to do with January 6th, here's something that a lot of my listeners ask me about that I want to give you the opportunity to explain in the way you think is important for us non-legal eagles to understand. There is this discussion about the slating of fake electors, and that is like deep-cut nerd stuff constitutionally and legally, and it's all being wrapped up in this conversation surrounding this Donald Trump indictment. What do people need to know about what Donald Trump tried to do, what was legal, what might not have been legal? What can you tell us?
I guess the first thing I would say about it, Annie, is what I used to say to jurors of non-lawyers, which is that you don't check your common sense at the door when you come into a courtroom. And I think using your common sense, or at least what passes for my common sense, what I remember about this is that what's now called the fake electors, like it's a big thing, at the time of January 6th was frivolous. Nobody thought that there were multiple slates of electors. Nobody thought that, this exercise that the Trump team had gone through of having, their supporters show up in some of these states and get themselves or go through a process that they themselves came up with to designate themselves as electors. Nobody for a second thought that those were the official state-certified electors and that this was actually going to be a thing on January 6th where they might get appointed as electors. That was never going to happen. So I think this is one of these things that reads a lot more intriguingly than it actually played out in real time. So here's what I understand the allegation essentially to be. What's called the fake electors, in the minds of people who volunteered to do this, the electors themselves, they didn't think of themselves as fake. they thought of themselves as contingent, which means their understanding was they weren't pretending to be state certified electors. They were saying they stood ready to step into the shoes for electoral college purposes to cast that state's electoral votes if the Trump team was able to succeed in the courts or the state legislatures or with the state election officials in getting them to vacate the popular election in that state and substitute a legislative finding that Trump had won, which was what Trump was trying to accomplish. So these people didn't understand themselves to be doing anything wrong. What they were there for was if this unlikely contingency happened, they would go to the Electoral College and vote the state's votes for Trump, but only because it had been legally that the election had been legally vacated. And what appears to have happened is there were certificates of this exercise that were sent to Washington, and there was talk among the Trump team that this could be part of the package of things that they could present to Pence and to the Republicans in Congress as further arguments for why these Biden states electors shouldn't be counted and why they should either discount the votes or remand the election back to those states. But there was never any chance that it was going to happen because nobody believed that these people were actually certified by the only officials who, by law in those states, are allowed to certify electors. So I think the whole thing is, I just think it reads now like it was this big, sinister thing that they were trying to pull over everyone's eyes. And in the meantime, in real time, I was following this very closely, and it was a laughable exercise.
You know, I think listening to you explain that, Andy McCarthy, that what you've just explained there becomes a political calamity for the Trump people, but not really any sort of criminal liability for the Trump people. And that becomes very useful for people to perpetuate this story about fake electors and stealing the election when you're talking about constitutionally it sounds like what could have been pursued there would be a bit of a political constitutional, or excuse me, a constitutional unicorn. And when I think about where the Trump side was kind of trying to move the conversation on January 6th, it seems to me like any conversation that was actually kind of formulating like maybe this was a topic that was going to be discussed with all eyes in the country watching what Congress was going to do that day, that the riot that took place actually hurt Donald Trump's ability to have that conversation pursue.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and some of the people who were involved in some of the planning for January 6th have made that very point, which is that if you buy the idea that that Trump had something to do with the riot, with like actionably, criminally instigating it, that would be counterintuitive to having this other fraud plot going, because the effect of the riot was to reject any other gambit that the Trump people might have come up with and say we have to put this behind us right now and vote to certify Biden's victory. So that is actually what happened. And I think the other important point you make there, Annie, is that when you say that this could have been a political problem for Trump, as I said at the beginning, the political calamity here is the one that's actually actionable, which is the impeachment process. So if he was trying to scheme this fake electors thing the way that they allege, you wouldn't have to find a penal crime for that because impeachment doesn't require that. But you could argue that it's an article of impeachment because his obligation, his oath as president, is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and that scheme was meant to undermine the Constitution. So even if it wasn't a criminal offense, it might be an impeachable offense. And that's why, again, I think this whole thing is like you're trying to take a political square peg and squeeze it into the round hole of the criminal justice system.
Yeah. We're speaking with Andy McCarthy. I've got one last question for you, because this is something that you discussed with me at a previous indictment. It's hard to keep them all separate at this point.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you mentioned was that Donald Trump really believes what he has been saying, that the idea that the election was stolen is something that Donald Trump has his heart and his head in, and he believes it. And when you've said that, when I've heard that from other people, I wonder if it's really his best defense. Because I, as a voter and somebody who wants to see the Republicans victorious in 2024, I kind of want him politically to stop talking about it. But I'm wondering if his perpetuating of bringing up the idea that, of course, the election was stolen really fortifies publicly the understanding that, no, this guy really believes what he's saying. And if he didn't believe it, if he was just trying to say it to incite action at the Capitol or to incite people to donate and lying to the American people to incite an action out of him, that might actually undermine his best defense in some of these cases.
Yeah, it undermines him both politically and legally. It undermines him politically because while this may be catnip for his base, which punches above its weight in the Republican primary nomination, 70% of the country hates this. So, the thought that you could go to the general electorate and say, now we're going to relitigate the 2020 election, they are not interested in this stuff. So I think it really, it confirms that if he's the nominee and that's the way he goes, there's no way that he could that he could win the election. So that's a political problem. And the legal problem, I think, is whatever he thought, let's say he really did believe what he said or he didn't believe what he was saying, is beside the point if the things they've charged him with are not actually crimes. So I think his best defense in the case is to argue that, for example, legally, fraud in the United States under the Supreme Court's most recent decisions, and really decisions that go back about 30, 40 years now, is that fraud in the United States is a financial crime. It's bilking people out of money or tangible property, and it is not the kind of scheme that is laid out in the indictment. I think he can argue that on the obstruction counts, that what they're trying to criminalize is John Eastman's legal theory which was a cockamamie theory, that the vice president had the power to discount state electoral votes. But we've never in this country considered a frivolous legal theory to be a felony. As I told people, defense lawyers are very creative people. When I was a prosecutor, if frivolous legal theories were a felony, then I could have indicted 5 of them a day. And then the final thing is the civil rights thing. That civil rights statute that Smith has invoked for this case was actually enacted following the Civil War to go after the Ku Klux Klan in the South, preventing Black Americans from exercising their right to vote. So it was intended when it was enacted to go after forcible conduct that was preventing people from voting. It's been extended over time, I don't think properly, to other contexts in which you can impede the act of voting, like ballot stuffing situations and that sort of thing. But what went on here was not Trump didn't prevent anyone from voting. What happened here is after the fact of voting, he tried to go through the courts and the legislatures to discount those votes and get the legislature to substitute a vote for him, which you can find that reprehensible. I do under the circumstances, but it's not really what that civil rights statute was intended to address. So I think his best argument here, Annie, is against do these laws really apply to this conduct, not whether he believed it or he didn't believe it.
Andy McCarthy, it is such a privilege to speak to you on these issues, and we're really grateful for your time. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Of course. Contributing editor at the National Review, fellow at the National Review Institute, Fox News contributor, and former chief assistant U.S. attorney, Andy McCarthy.